Hello, and welcome to your Section 8 Housing Choice Voucher briefing. This briefing will help you to understand where and how to find a place to live, what will be expected of you during your participation, and what to expect from the program. If you should have any additional questions after this briefing, please contact the Housing Authority office, where a member of our staff will be able to assist you with any questions you may have. McKean County Housing Authority is committed to ensuring full access to participating in our housing programs. If you need an accommodation for a disability in order to have full access to our services, please let our housing staff know. You should have already received your briefing packet. We will be reviewing all of the items in this packet, so you should have it nearby to review as we go through this briefing. You should also have a pen and paper ready to take notes or jot down any questions you may have. The handbook that you were provided in your briefing packet will follow along with this briefing video. Also included in your briefing packet is your voucher and briefing acknowledgement form. These need to be signed and returned to the Housing Authority. These must be returned prior to an inspection being completed or contracts being executed. The Section 8 Housing Choice Voucher Program is the federal government's primary program for assisting low-income families, the elderly, and persons with disabilities to afford decent, safe, and sanitary housing in the private market. Since housing assistance is provided on behalf of the Housing Choice Voucher tenant, participants are able to find their own housing. Housing Choice Vouchers are administered locally by public housing agencies that receive federal funds from the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, or HUD. This program can only be successful with a solid partnership between the Housing Authority, the landlord, and the participant. All three parties are connected by three different documents. The Housing Authority and landlord are connected by the HAP contract. The landlord and you, the tenant, are connected by the lease. You and the Housing Authority are connected by the voucher. This means that the tenant, landlord, and housing authority all have obligations and responsibilities to each other under the Housing Choice Voucher Program. It is important that you know and understand these responsibilities. McKean County Housing Authority administers the Housing Choice Voucher Program locally and provides the Housing Choice Voucher participants with housing assistance. The Housing Authority must determine that you are eligible for the program, issue you a voucher, ensure that the housing unit you choose meets minimum housing quality standards, make assistance payments to the landlord, and make sure that the owners and participants follow the program rules and taking action when necessary. The role of the landlord in the Housing Choice Voucher Program is to select a good tenant and complete any screening processes they determine to be necessary while following fair housing laws. They must provide decent, safe, and sanitary housing to the tenant at a reasonable rate. The dwelling unit must pass the program's housing quality standards and be maintained up to those standards as long as the owner receives housing assistance payments. They must collect the rent from the family and enforce the lease. Your responsibilities as a participant are to find suitable housing, take good care of that housing unit, abide by the landlord's lease, and comply with the family obligations in the voucher program and housing agency's rules. It is very important that you understand these obligations so that you can successfully participate in the program. Failing to abide by McKean County Housing Authority or HUD regulations could result in the termination of your assistance. These obligations are listed in your handbook as well as on your voucher. We're going to go over them now. The participating family must supply any information that McKean County Housing Authority or HUD determines to be necessary, including evidence of citizenship or eligible immigration status, and information for use in regularly scheduled examinations or interim re-examination of family income and composition. 2 missed appointments to supply the Housing Authority with this information is considered a breach of family responsibility. The family must disclose and verify Social Security numbers and sign and submit consent forms for obtaining information. The family must supply any information requested by the Housing Authority to verify that the family is living in the unit or information related to family absence from the unit. The family must promptly notify the Housing Authority in writing when the family is away from the unit for an extended period of time in accordance with Housing Authority policies. The family must notify the Housing Authority and the owner in writing before moving out of the unit or terminating the lease. The family must allow the Housing Authority to inspect the unit at reasonable times and after reasonable notice. 2 missed appointments for inspection is considered a breach of this family responsibility. The family must use the assisted unit for residence by the family. The unit must be the family's only residence. The family must promptly notify the Housing Authority in writing of the birth, adoption, or court-awarded custody of a child. The family must request McKean County Housing Authority's written approval to add any other family member as an occupant of the unit. The family must promptly notify McKean County Housing Authority in writing if any family member no longer lives in the unit. The family must give McKean County Housing Authority a copy of the owner eviction notice. The family must pay utility bills and supply appliances that the owner is not required to supply under the lease. The information that you provide must be true and complete. The family must not own or have any interest in the unit. The family must not commit any serious or repeated violations of the lease. The family must not commit fraud, bribery, or any other corrupt or criminal act in connection with the program. The family must not participate in any illegal drug, alcohol, or violent criminal activity. The family must not sublease or sublet the unit, assign the lease, or transfer the unit. The family must not receive Section 8 tenant-based program housing assistance while receiving another housing subsidy for the same unit or a different unit under any other federal, state, or local housing assistance program. The family must not damage the unit or premises, other than damage from ordinary wear and tear, or permit any guest to damage the unit or premises. The family must not engage in threatening, abusive, or violent behavior toward any housing authority personnel. The family must not be related to the landlord. The landlord cannot be the parent, child, grandparent, grandchild, sister, or brother of any member of the participating family. The only exception that may be approved for McKean County Housing Authority is if a family member is a person with disabilities. Let's take out your voucher now. Your voucher is the most important document in your briefing packet and is your contract of participation with the Housing Authority. You will need to sign and date the voucher and return it to our office. Your voucher is good for 60 days. The voucher expiration date is listed on your voucher. You may request an additional 60-day extension by submitting a written request to our office. Your request must include a list of landlords that you have contacted. Any additional requests for extensions must be done through a reasonable accommodation, which we will discuss later. It is a good idea to read the voucher in full. You are responsible for knowing and understanding your obligations through the voucher. The size of your voucher is determined by the size and composition of your family. The voucher size listed on your voucher will determine the maximum amount of subsidy available to you. Our subsidy standards and how we determine your voucher size is included in your briefing packet. Please note, if you choose a unit that has more bedrooms than your voucher size will not be increased. If you choose a unit that has less bedrooms than your voucher size will be decreased to match the actual size of the unit you have chosen. Now that you have your voucher, you can begin your housing search. You should review the brochure, A Good Place to Live, located in your briefing packet. Your voucher is good for anywhere in McKean County. You also have the option to transfer your voucher to another county. This is called portability, and we will be reviewing this in more detail later. Some things to keep in mind while searching for a unit are: will the dwelling pass the Housing Quality Standards inspection? There is a checklist included in your briefing packet that will help you to determine this. Is the neighborhood generally considered to be safe with adequate police protection? Are neighboring homes and other buildings well maintained? Is there adequate transportation? What amenities are available in the community, such as parks, libraries, and recreational facilities? Will the school system provide adequate educational opportunities for your children? Are programs available for special needs children? What is the landlord's reputation? Is the proposed rent and utilities within McKean County Housing Authority's payment standard? You must also keep in mind that you are required to sign a 1-year lease and will not be eligible to move within the first year of that lease. Once you have identified a unit to rent, McKean County Housing Authority will help you to determine if it is affordable. Some questions you should be asking the landlord prior to selecting a unit are: what is the owner's maintenance policy? Are pets allowed? How much is the security deposit? Are any utilities included in the rent? And who supplies the stove and refrigerator? Included in your handbook is a landlord list. This list is comprised of current Housing Choice Voucher landlords. You do not have to stick to this list. Any landlord can become a Housing Choice Voucher landlord. The McKean County Housing Authority has a listing of available units on our website that is updated weekly. You should also be checking the local newspapers and online forums for available unit listings. Please keep in mind that you are prohibited from renting from a family member unless approved through a reasonable accommodation. When the voucher holder finds a unit that they wish to occupy and reaches an agreement with the landlord over the lease terms, the Housing Authority must inspect the dwelling and determine that the rent requested is reasonable. You should not sign a lease with the landlord until the unit is approved by the Housing Authority. The Housing Authority determines a payment standard that is the amount generally needed to rent a moderately priced dwelling unit in the local housing market, and that is used to calculate the amount of housing assistance a family will receive. However, the payment standard does not limit and does not affect the amount of rent a landlord can charge or the family may pay. The payment standard puts a cap on the maximum amount of assistance the Housing Authority can pay. The payment standard includes utilities. When the lease does not include utilities, the tenant is provided a utility allowance. Allowances are a conservative cost of tenant-paid utilities. The payment standard and utility allowances are both reviewed and updated annually. A family which receives a housing voucher can select a unit with a rent that is below or above the payment standard. The housing voucher family must pay 30% of its monthly adjusted gross income for rent and utilities. And if the unit rent is greater than the payment standard, the family is required to pay the additional amount. By law, whenever a family moves to a new unit where the rent exceeds the payment standard, the family may not pay more than 40% of its adjusted monthly income for rent. The current payment standards for McKean County Housing Authority are located in your briefing packet. Be sure to take a minute to review the brochure determining your portion of rent. The Housing Authority can also help you to determine if the unit you have identified is affordable and if the rent requested is reasonable. In order to do this, we will need to know the following information: the location of the unit, the proposed contract rent, who is responsible for what utilities, and the bedroom size of the unit. Included in your briefing packet is a packet of paperwork referred to as the move-in packet. Once you have identified a unit you wish to rent, you will complete this packet with the landlord and return it to the Housing Authority. Once the packet is received, the Housing Authority will determine if the rent is reasonable and schedule the inspection. Your handbook has samples of these documents so that they can be completed correctly. Incomplete packets will not be accepted. This packet must be returned to the Housing Authority prior to your voucher expiration date. There are 4 required documents in the move-in packet: the request for tenancy approval, a rent reasonableness assessment data sheet, a sample lease and tenancy addendum, and a lead-based paint disclosure form. The lead-based paint disclosure form must be completed for all homes, regardless of when they were built. There is a pamphlet in your briefing packet, Protect Your Family from Lead in Your Home. The lease that we provide is not the required lease. The landlord should use the same lease for subsidized units as they do for unsubsidized units. The tenancy addendum should be attached to the landlord's lease. As a reminder, you should not sign a lease until the unit is approved by the Housing Authority. If you currently live in the unit and have a lease, you will need to start a new lease to coincide with your housing assistance. Once the rent has been determined to be reasonable, your inspection will be scheduled. Please review the brochure, A Good Place to Live, as well as the Housing Quality Standards checklist. Both are included in your briefing packet. The initial inspection of your unit will be completed within 15 days of receiving the completed move-in packet. It is good practice for both the landlord and tenant to be present for the initial inspection. It is also recommended that you and the landlord complete a move-in inspection documenting the condition of the unit. A move-in inspection form is included in your briefing packet. Taking pictures is a great way to document the current condition of the unit. There are 3 other types of inspections that will occur during your participation with the Housing Choice Voucher Program. An annual inspection will be completed on or near your annual recertification. A special inspection can be requested by the participant, landlord, or a third party. Generally, these are requested because the participant feels the landlord is failing to maintain the property appropriately, or vice versa. It is expected that you communicate any concerns with your landlord and allow the landlord reasonable time to address those concerns prior to contacting the Housing Authority. Quality control inspections are done several times throughout the year. These are re-inspections of randomly selected units that have recently passed inspection. This is done to ensure compliance with program regulations. If your unit fails inspection during an initial inspection, the landlord will be provided with a list of deficient items. You and the landlord will then need to discuss whether or not those repairs will be made. If the landlord determines that they do not wish to make the repairs, you will need to move on to another unit. If the landlord does agree to make the repairs, the Housing Authority will do a re-inspection of the unit once the repairs have been made. If your unit fails an annual, special, or quality control inspection, the landlord and participant are provided with a list of deficient items. Depending on the severity of the deficiency, the time frame for repairs could be 24 hours to 30 days. The participant could be held responsible for breaches of HQS if they are caused by non-payment of utilities paid by the family, not providing or failing to maintain appliances not provided by the owner, and damages to the unit or premises caused by a household member or guest beyond normal wear and tear. If the family is responsible but the owner carries out the repairs, the owner will be encouraged to bill the family for the cost of the repairs. The owner is responsible for vermin infestation, even if it is caused by the family's living habits. However, if such infestation is serious or repeated, it may be considered a lease violation and the owner may evict for serious or repeated violations of the lease. McKean County Housing Authority may terminate the family's assistance on that basis. When it has been determined that a unit on the program fails to meet HQS standards and the owner is responsible for completing the necessary repairs, but fails to do so during the specified time period, the assistance payment to the landlord will be abated. In some instances, an extension could be granted in lieu of abatement. The tenant is not responsible for the housing authority's portion of rent that is abated. When the deficiencies are determined to be the responsibility of the tenant and they fail to make the repairs in the specified time period, the tenant would then be non-compliant with the program and could therefore be subject to termination. In some instances, an extension could be granted. Once the chosen unit has been determined reasonable and has passed inspection, it'll be time to execute contracts. At this time, you will sign the lease with your landlord and provide the housing authority with a copy. The housing authority will enter into a HAP contract with the landlord. You will also be required to sign a summary worksheet, rent calculation worksheet, and a fraud affidavit confirming that the information provided to the housing authority regarding your family composition, income, assets, and expenses is true and accurate. A lease amendment will be created and signed by the housing authority, the participant, and the landlord. This document lists the property address that is being subsidized and breaks down the rent responsibilities for each party. Security deposits are the responsibility of the family. If the family is unable to pay a security deposit, they should communicate with the landlord to see if payment arrangements can be made. If a participant is unable to pay the security deposit and the landlord is not willing to make payment arrangements, the participant should contact the housing authority for any resources for assistance in getting the security deposit paid. Now that we have gotten through finding a unit, determining your rent, passing inspection, and executing documents, let's talk about some ongoing activities that are going to occur while you're participating in this program. There are 2 activities that the Housing Authority must conduct annually: recertification of family income and family composition, and HQS inspections. We already discussed the annual HQS inspection. Annually, on your anniversary of your admission to the Housing Choice Voucher Program, the Housing Authority will examine your household income, size, and composition. This is done to determine your rent portion and eligibility. Failure to complete your annual recertification could result in termination of your assistance. In addition to the annual activities is interim recertification. HUD requires program participants to report all changes in household income or composition to the Housing Authority between annual reexaminations. McKean County Housing Authority requires these changes to be reported within 10 days of the change occurring. Please note, additions to your household must be approved prior to moving in, with the exception of birth, adoption, and court-awarded custody. Before a minor can be added to your household, you must show proof that you have legal custody of the minor. All adults in the household must pass a criminal background check before they would be approved as a member of the household. Any adult who has been in the household more than 30 days in a 12-month period will be considered to be living in the unit and must be added to the household. When a change is made to your tenant portion of rent due to recertification, you will be notified and new contract paperwork will be mailed to you. In the instance that your tenant portion of rent increases, you will be provided with 30 days notice prior to the effective date of the change, provided that the Housing Authority was notified of the change in the proper time frame. Participants should review the handbook for examples of changes that would require reporting and the process for reporting those. Landlords are constantly concerned with rising costs and whether rent revenues will cover their operating expenses while allowing for a reasonable return on their investment. Because of this, landlords may ask for rental increases on an annual basis. Before the rent can be increased on an assisted unit, the landlord must provide the tenant a 60-day written notice of the proposed rent increase. A copy of this notice must be provided to the Housing Authority. Landlords are also required to complete the authority's owner request for rent increase form. The authority will evaluate all rent increase requests to determine whether the proposed rent is reasonable based on the rents charged for comparable rental units in the unassisted market. If it is determined that the tenant was not given sufficient notice of the increase or that the proposed rent is not reasonable, the proposed rent will not be approved. Oftentimes, landlords choose to sell their rental properties. If the family is in the first year of their lease term, the prospective buyer must agree to assume the term of the current lease and contract. If the lease term has gone over the first initial 12-month period, the new owner can ask the family to vacate as per their lease. Moving. If the participating family wished to move to a new unit, after determining that the family is eligible for the move, McKean County Housing Authority will issue the family a new voucher. If a family moves to another unit without notifying the Housing Authority in writing, it will be considered to be a violation of the family obligations and reason for termination. Families will be eligible to move if the assisted lease for the old unit has terminated because McKean County Housing Authority has terminated the HAP contract for an owner breach, or the lease was terminated by mutual agreement of the owner and the family, if the owner has given the family a notice to vacate, or has obtained a court judgment or other process allowing the owner to evict the family, unless assistance to the family will be terminated. The family has given the proper notice of lease termination if the family has a right to terminate the lease. Families will not be permitted to move within the Housing Authority's jurisdiction during the initial year of assisted occupancy. Families will not be permitted to move outside the Housing Authority's jurisdiction under portability during the initial year of assisted occupancy. Families will not be permitted to move more than once in a 12-month period. McKean County Housing Authority will deny permission to move if the family has violated a family obligation or the family owes the Housing Authority money. Portability allows families to move out of the area while retaining the voucher. Under portability, families are eligible to receive assistance to lease a unit outside of the initial Housing Authority's jurisdiction. Please review the portability brochure included in your briefing packet. Lease terminations. As stated before, the initial term of the lease is 1 year and renews on a month-to-month basis unless terminated by the landlord or the tenant. The tenant must give the landlord at least 30, but not more than 60 days written notice that they intend to vacate the unit. This notice must comply with the lease. A copy of the notice should always be sent to the Housing Authority. Tenants are not required to give a reason to vacate. However, breaking the lease or giving insufficient notice may jeopardize their continued participation in the Section 8 program. The landlord may only terminate tenancy in accordance with the lease addendum, and the HAP contract. During the initial term of the lease, the landlord may only terminate the tenancy because of serious or repeated violations of the lease, violation of federal, state, or local law that imposes obligations on the tenant in connection with the occupancy or use of the unit and the premises, criminal activity, other good cause. During the first term of the lease, there must be something the family did or failed to do. Some good cause examples are disturbing the neighbors, damaging the property, or poor housekeeping habits that cause damage to the unit or the premises. After the initial term of the lease, the landlord may terminate the lease for any good causes, including the tenant's failure to accept the offer of a new lease or revision to the existing lease. Please note the landlord must present this offer at least 60 calendar days prior to the proposed beginning date of the new lease. The landlord's desire to utilize the unit as a residential unit, or a business or economic reason for termination of tenancy, such as the sale of the property, renovation of the unit, or desire to rent at a higher rate. The HAP contract may be terminated by the Housing Authority for the following reasons. If the lease is terminated for any reason, if the unit fails to meet HQS requirements, if the family moves out for any reason, if McKean County Housing Authority is not responsible for any portion of the contract rent for a period of 180 calendar days, if the family size decreases or increases with proper notice from McKean County Housing Authority, if the family is terminated from the program, or if the landlord is not in compliance with the provisions of the HAP contract. If McKean County Housing Authority terminates the HAP contract for any reason, the lease automatically terminates. We do require, as per the HAP contract for the landlord and the family obligations for the tenant, that copies of termination and eviction notices be furnished to McKean County Housing Authority. If you ever receive a termination or eviction notice from your landlord, we strongly encourage you to immediately contact McKean County Housing Authority to discuss the matter. Evictions. An eviction action is obviously a very serious matter. If you are evicted from your dwelling because you violated your lease, you will not only lose your home, but may lose your Section 8 voucher as well. Remember, McKean County Housing Authority is not your landlord. It is important to point out that the authority does not initiate, approve, or otherwise direct the termination of any lease or the eviction of any tenant. All such actions are the responsibility of the landlord and must be done in accordance with state and local law, and as stipulated in the HAP contract and lease. There is no distinction between Section 8 and private rental tenants concerning evictions. The Pennsylvania landlord-tenant law applies equally to both. It is important that all tenants and landlords know and understand their lease in order to avoid evictions and/or terminations. In the event that your landlord must actually bring an eviction action, HAP payments will continue to the landlord until a court decision or your actual eviction from the premises. If the rent has been abated because of the failed inspection, no payment can be made. Landlords can never evict a tenant for non-payment of the authority's portion of the rent, only for the tenant's portion. Informal hearings and reviews. Section 8 applicants who do not meet initial eligibility requirements or program participants who have not complied with family obligation requirements can be denied assistance or have their assistance terminated. Such families have the right to an informal hearing by a third party to determine if McKean County Housing Authority has denied or terminated assistance in accordance with HUD rules and regulations and authority policies. A third party will listen to both the family and McKean County Housing Authority representatives to determine if the authority's decision was appropriate. The hearing officer must be someone other than the person making or approving the decision and must be knowledgeable of the rules and regulations of the Section 8 program. A benefit to having a voucher in our program is the Family Self-Sufficiency Program. FSS is a program that enables HUD-assisted families to increase their earned income and reduce their dependency on welfare assistance and rental subsidies. Please review the FSS flyer and brochure located in your briefing packet for more information. A reasonable accommodation is a change, exception, or adjustment to a rule, policy, practice, or service that may be necessary for a person with disabilities to have an equal opportunity to use and enjoy a dwelling, including public and common use spaces, or to fulfill their program obligations. Any change in the way things are customarily done that enables a person with disabilities to enjoy housing opportunities or to meet program requirements is a reasonable accommodation. In other words, reasonable accommodations eliminate barriers that prevent persons with disabilities from fully participating in housing opportunities, including both private housing and in federally assisted programs. Since rules, policies, practices, and services may have a different effect on persons with disabilities than on other persons, treating persons with disabilities exactly the same as others will sometimes deny persons with disabilities an equal opportunity to enjoy a dwelling or participate in the program. Not all persons with disabilities will have a need to request a reasonable accommodation. However, all persons with disabilities have a right to request or be provided a reasonable accommodation at any time. VAWA offers protections for anyone, regardless of gender, who has been a victim of domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, or stalking. VAWA protects victims from losing their housing due to domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, or stalking. A notice regarding your rights under VAWA is included in your briefing packet. Non-discrimination laws prohibit you from being treated differently because of your age, religion, gender, disability, color, national origin, or familial status. HUD housing programs are also open to all eligible individuals and families, regardless of sexual orientation, gender, identity, or marital status. If you feel you have been denied your rights due to unlawful discrimination, you can get help by filing a housing discrimination complaint through the housing agency, HUD, or any state or local agency that specializes in fair housing laws. You will need to find a suitable dwelling. You'll need to complete the paperwork with the landlord and submit it to the housing authority. McKean County Housing Authority will then determine that the requested rent is affordable and reasonable and will negotiate the rent with the landlord if necessary. Once the requested rent is approved, McKean County Housing Authority will schedule the initial inspection. Please remember, it is recommended that you attend the inspection as well as the landlord. Once the unit passes the initial inspection, contracts will be executed. You will sign the lease with your landlord and a copy will be sent to the Housing Authority. The Housing Authority and the landlord will sign the HAP contract and assistance payments will begin. Please remember that as a Housing Choice Voucher participant, you have obligations to both the Housing Authority and the landlord. By reading through the information provided to you, you are setting yourself up for success in the Housing Choice Voucher program. Do not forget to sign and date your voucher and briefing acknowledgement form and get them returned to the Housing Authority. Thank you for attending this briefing. If you have any additional questions, please contact our Housing Authority office.